Welcome everybody as we begin our special evening with Walter Russell Mead. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. This is our office space, and we're excited to co-host this event with our partners, the Philos Project. Obviously, the star of the evening is Walter Russell Mead and his new book, The Ark of a Covenant, that everyone is reviewing highly favorably. I'm sure you've read some of the reviews. Walter, if I understand the format correctly, will be interviewed by Andrew Doran of the Philos Project. Andrew is an old friend, previously at the State Department, among other distinguished accomplishments across his very long life and long career. So you all are going to interact for about 40 minutes. Is that accurate,
yes,
Andrew?
Yes, that's right, 45.
And then there will be, that should take us to about 7:15, after which there will be plenty of time for your questions and comments, perhaps up to 8 o'clock, depends on the quality of your questions and comments. We'll see how that goes. But we're delighted that you're here, and we are broadcasting this live on IRD's social media, and we'll afterwards post it to our YouTube, and perhaps the Philos Project will as well. So, Andrew, you can take it from here.
Thank you. I think I'm
all right,
mic'd up and good to go. On behalf of the Philos Project, welcome, and I'd like to welcome Walter back to IRD and thank our co-hosts, the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Walter, at the somewhere near the outset of Ark of a Covenant, in the first chapter, you reference the optimistic American missionaries of the 19th century, a reference to the Williams College Haystack prayer meeting of 1806, from which famously missionaries went forth to the Near East to spread the gospel, and those missionaries became having failed somewhat in that endeavor, became educators, and those educators formed the two most famous universities in the Middle East, AUB and LAU, in what is present-day Lebanon, was then Syria, part of the Ottoman Empire. And those professors and their children and grandchildren became what were known as the Arabists at the State Department, a class of diplomats that are really your launching point in Special Providence, an earlier book. But you write in that first chapter, in reality, the missionary work contributed to the national and sectarian conflicts that led to genocidal massacres of Middle East Christians and brought some of the world's oldest Christian communities to the brink of extinction. The work of the Philos Project uniquely consists of positive engagement in both Israel and with the ancient Near Eastern Christian communities. So I think we'd be very interested to hear how it is that this story of those missionaries is often overlooked, how it shaped U.S. foreign policy in the region, and how it shaped the U.S. relationship with Israel.
All right. Well, thank you for the question, and Mark, thanks to IRD and thanks to Philos for hosting this event. It's always good, those of you who know new parents know that there's nothing they would rather do than talk about their children, and new authors are much the same way, so we'll talk incessantly if given the chance. The story of kind of Christian engagement in the Middle East is one of deep paradox and frustration. Part of my interest in writing the Ark of a Covenant about the U.S.-Israel relationship is actually to try to highlight ways in which in the past Christians have made some pretty fundamental errors in their approach to American foreign policy. Certainly today, when I hear bishops or other ecclesiastical dignitaries pronouncing on foreign affairs, I have a skepticism that's informed by study of hundreds of years of American history. These folks are not very good at foreign policy. What sort of the rise of Arab nationalism was very much something that American missionaries helped to create. And I don't want to say that Arab nationalism was entirely a bad thing, or that didn't have its positive elements. But having originally failed to convert the Jews, and so leaving Jerusalem for what they hoped would be the more fertile fields of Beirut, the early missionaries soon discovered they weren't going to do a lot of converting with the Muslims either. Partly because a lot of Muslims were resistant to Christian teaching, and partly because the Ottoman government, which was willing to allow a certain amount of missionary activity, would definitely respond strongly to stories of mass conversions or things of that kind. So the idea then sort of hit, well, what can we do that's effective? Well, one reason that the people in this part of the world have such a negative view of Christianity is that Christians in the Middle East are considered poor, marginalized, and badly educated. Now, they weren't all like that, but some were. And also from the standpoint of our good Protestant missionaries, the traditional Orthodox, Monophysite, and other churches of the Middle East weren't really what American Protestant missionaries thought the gospel was all about. So the target of missionary activity moved to the position of the Christian community, trying to help Christians achieve more, do better, promote Christian education, but also promote the idea of a secular national Arab identity, so that whether you were Muslim or Christian was not as important as whether your mother tongue was Arabic and your culture was Arabic. Because the hope was that by creating this kind of secular, forward-looking nationalism, you would promote conditions of equality and association of Christians in the Arab world. And in fact, to some degree, that had some success in that Saddam Hussein's foreign minister was a Christian. And the Assad regime in Syria also had and has had pretty good relations with many Christians there. And in Egypt as well, you've seen educated Christians playing significant roles in Egyptian government. So to some degree, this had success, but part of the price of that was to promote a very anti-Israel stance among not only Muslims, but also among, and particularly among, Arab Christians, where if you wanted to show, yes, I'm a fully paid up member of the Arab national awakening, the easiest way to demonstrate that was to be the most zealous person around on denouncing Israel and the schemes of the Jews and whatnot and whatnot. And so in addition to sort of genuine feeling about Zionism in the region, there came to be a kind of a tactical Christian stance here. And I'm not judging anybody. People live where they live, and they need to make the choices that they think are going to work out best for them and their children. But we should, when we're trying to understand how American Christian interventions in the Middle East have often gone awry, this might be one example. But more than that, because the Christian efforts to enhance the economic status of local Christians coincided with the economic penetration of the Middle East by foreign capital and companies, so that the Industrial Revolution is sweeping through Europe and the United States, and Europe, having been poorer than the Middle East through much of the Middle Ages, is suddenly much richer. And the Christians who enjoy privileged contact with the West, often through their participation, their studies in mission schools where they're learning English. Some of them are being sent back to the U.S. And by the way, Catholic mission groups associated with the French government had the same record. Christians find themselves benefiting from the growing Western presence in the region at the same time that Arab nationalism and anti-imperialism is becoming a tougher force. So Christians often ended up getting hit from both ends, that their economic associations and cultural associations with increasingly unpopular Western Christians made them unpopular among Arab nationalists, at the same time that Christians were trying to make Arab nationalism one of the forces that could promote their integration into the wider community. Now, this story is by no means over, but communal tensions were significantly enhanced in some cases by the unintended consequence of missionary action.
Thank you, Walter. In Ark of a Covenant, you also refer at different points explaining America's understanding of its own self-conceptions and how its foreign policy is shaped through the four traditions or four American temperaments, which you develop at greater length in, again, Special Providence. Could you explain those four American traditions and how they relate to U.S. foreign policy with respect to Israel and the Near East?
Okay, big questions you're asking. In Special Providence, I divided American foreign policy into sort of four schools of thought, because my own study of American foreign policy basically said, as a country, we haven't gotten very far since George Washington's administration. We're still arguing about foreign policy in ways that we did then, and the argument is no closer to an answer. And if you look at the history of the United States, you can see sort of four voices continually supporting different approaches to foreign policy. One of them is what I call Hamiltonianism or American realism, and this is the idea that we should be like England, which was the most successful state of that time. That is, we should have a powerful financial system which the federal government promotes. So England has the Bank of England, we'll have the Bank of the United States, or today the Federal Reserve. And this will create American capital markets, which the government supports, will help develop strong corporations in the United States. We will build a strong Navy which can protect American commerce globally. And the wealth that comes to the country from this economic development will keep people happy with our form of government, build loyalty to the country, and also keep us safe and respected at home and abroad. And that school of thought has been a powerful force. It's probably the best description of George Washington's approach to foreign policy. But Abraham Lincoln called himself a Hamiltonian. Theodore Roosevelt called himself a Hamiltonian. People have consciously picked up this tradition and worked with it all through American history. The next tradition is the Wilsonian tradition. Name it after Wilson, though it began before him. And this is the idea that America is a country that is called by God to transform the world. And this has both secular and religious roots. Religiously, it connects with the idea of America as almost like the ancient Hebrews, a people that's been given a treasure that isn't just a treasure for ourselves. We can't selfishly hoard it, but a treasure that is to be shared with the whole world. And Israel had monotheism, we have democracy, liberty, and for many years people thought also American Protestant theory, the purest form as they saw it of the Christian religion. And so it is our duty to share these principles. Also, like the ancient Hebrews, when we do the right thing, we prosper. When we support human rights, democracy, and other good things around the world, we prosper. But when we allow ourselves to be tempted into alliances with autocrats or to pursue our purely selfish goals, then we'll be punished. So this is almost a sense of America as a new Israel. And obviously when it comes to the old Israel, and then now the new Israel again, that bears a lot of weight. Third group, Jeffersonians after Thomas Jefferson, basically think the more the U.S. is engaged overseas, the more we will corrode democracy and liberty today. So this would be people like the Cato Institute and Quincy Institute, I suppose, who believe that minimizing American engagement overseas, it maximizes American liberty at home and even security, because if we're not messing with other people, why would they ever bother to attack us? And again, that school of thought has been around for a long time. At times it's been dominant, at times it's been almost driven out, but it is obviously still a force. And the final one is called after Andrew Jackson, which is, it says, normally we leave foreigners alone. They can worship one God, they can worship a zillion gods, they can have democracy, they can have dictatorship. We don't care. But what they can't do is attack the United States or any of our allies. And so Jacksonians, if you think about September 10th, 2001, most people in the United States didn't know where Afghanistan is, much less want to be involved with it in any way. On September 12th, Jacksonian America was ready to drop nuclear weapons on Afghanistan if that's what it took. So you saw the same thing at Pearl Harbor. You actually saw the same thing at Fort Sumter, where the South's attack on Fort Sumter unified the North behind Lincoln's war policy in a way that might not have happened otherwise. So those four schools, and I'm sure we can all think of politicians today who embody to different degrees those ideas. That's a kind of a kaleidoscope out of which American foreign policy is made, and none of these schools is usually strong enough to drive the others out. So in reality, foreign policy is a coalition. And you also have certain institutions. The State Department tends to be pretty Wilsonian in its sort of DNA. And so regardless of what a president wants, the institution is going to continue to push in a different direction. American public opinion tends to be, by and large, Jacksonian. I would say about if we take the bottom of Trump's appeal, which was about 38 to 40% when he was in office, that's probably not a bad measure of Jacksonian-leaning sentiment in the United States. And that's probably the largest single group. Now, in peace, it's a little hard to see, because sometimes in peacetime, Jacksonians sound a lot like Jeffersonians. They don't want to get involved. They certainly don't want to get involved in human rights missions or democracy promotion efforts overseas. But when the United States is attacked, or when they perceive a threat growing, then the Jacksonians and the real Jeffersonians split off. So now where it comes to Israel, in general, Wilsonians started out being very pro-Israel, both sympathy for, and maybe actually moving a bit away from the four schools here. Let's just say that one of the things Americans don't understand, or people certainly under 50 usually don't understand, is there was a time when support for Israel in the United States was a left-wing cause. In the 1950s, you wanted real supporters of Israel, you would talk to the Democratic Socialists of America, I kid you not, where Israel at that time, which was the most left-wing of all the non-communist countries, was the example of socialism that works, and socialism, Israel is proof that a socialist country can still be democratic. And it was the banner of the secular left. The success of Israel and its ability to defend itself. And President Eisenhower, who sympathized much more, hoped to build U.S. foreign policy around alliance with Nasser. And the Republicans were considered, they want to work for oil and oil companies and dictators. This is no way to win the Cold War. We must stand fast with democracy in Israel. And this is true up until the 1970s, really, where Israel, and by the way, this is true in Europe as well, the European left was very pro-Israel. As late as 1967, when the war began, tens of thousands of French students marched on the Israeli embassy in Paris. Now, They would do that today in the case of a war in the Middle East, but at that time they were volunteering to go work at civilian jobs in Israel to release more Israeli men to fight on the front. So Israel at that time was actually, by and large, more popular in Europe than in the US, and more popular on the left than on the right. So in American foreign policy, Israel, what happened is, as the left fell out of love with Israel, the right began to become more pro-Israel. This is partly because, having been a very socialist left-wing economy, in the 1970s, Israel sort of goes through its own version of Thatcherism and becomes, there's still a lot of regulation in the Israeli economy, but it is much more of a free market kind of economy now. So Israel moved out of the column of socialism works into the column of, even in Israel, they have decided that socialism doesn't work. So that's part of it. Part of it is it goes from being an underdog, where the Wilsonians, there's a sense that there's a certain sensibility in foreign policy that's always looking for weak darlings to love. The more you're an underdog, the more you're a loser, the more one's heart goes out to the poor, whoever they may be. And the Israelis go from being underdogs to overdogs, and the Palestinians become much more the underdog. And so you have a kind of a shift in the way a lot of people in the Wilsonian zone see that conflict. But then also, Israel goes from being a liability for American business, which made a lot of Hamiltonians in the 1950s were interested in strong American oil companies. They were interested in it. It was helpful. The Arab countries had written almost colonial contracts with oil companies, so the oil companies were really making very, very handsome profits, and they had the lion's share of revenue from the oil of the Middle East. But in the 1970s, the Arabs figured this out and renegotiated those contracts, so that there was no, in the 1950s, American oil companies saying, don't make the Arabs mad. They might wake up and read the oil contracts. Let them all sleep. Don't do anything to irritate them with the U.S. But in the 1970s and 1980s, this is much less of a factor. And Israel, through its tech prowess, its economic growth, becomes more attractive to Hamiltonians. Finally, as Israel becomes stronger, Jacksonians start saying, wow, this is a pretty cool country. They win wars. The contrast of 1967, when America is beginning to lose the Vietnam War, but Israel is stomping to victory in the Middle East. Whoa, that's interesting. And so you see, in America, the left is, I would not say the Democrats today in general are not anti-Israel. They are anti-Likud and concerned about Israel. Now you go into the far left of the Democrats and you see something different. But in general, American Democrats are less anti-Israel, certainly, and there's more pro-Israel sentiment among them than there is among European social democratic parties, often, or the European left. But what's unique in America is that for 30 years, support for Israel became a lodestar, almost a badge of identity on the sort of Reaganite right, the Sun Belt Republican movement, where politicians who would say, I'm pro-Israel, are telegraphing to their supporters, I'm pro-America, I'm pro-traditional America, I'm pro-you, was the way voters would hear it.
Thank you, Walter. At various points throughout the book, you take IR theorists to task and abstract theory to task. And specifically, I think it's safe to say that as you develop the Vulcan analogy, the search for planet Vulcan analogy, which is quite compelling as an analogy, you note that the more sophisticated and abstract IR theories tend to morph into anti-Zionist and even anti-Semitic arguments, whether that's intended or unintended, whether they come by it through good faith or not. And so could you discuss the perils of abstract theory, but also what is the quest for planet Vulcan theory that you develop as an analogy to how outsiders understand the U.S. relationship with Israel?
Well, let me flip the question, because it's probably easier to explain planet Vulcan first, and then do the other stuff. In the book, and you can all buy the book. It's sold at better bookstores everywhere. You can tell they're better bookstores because they have Ark of a Covenant in them. And it's also available at many reputable retailers online, and even some disreputable retailers. And you should definitely, I would say one may not be enough for the average household. There's so many uses to which a book can be put. Look, I make the point that in the late 19th century, there was a famous French astronomer who did some mathematical calculations and realized there was something wrong about the orbit of the planet Uranus. It didn't simply circle the, by the way, just think of Uranus, I do think of something that you said about Dan Rather, that when the U.S. sent a space probe out as far as the planet Uranus, it became for 2 weeks the planet Uranus, because Dan Rather basically told the staff at CBS News, I am not going to stand there on national TV and say, satellite reveals that there are rings around Uranus. The planet Uranus, if we prefer, it wobbled in its orbit. And what could be causing that? Really only another planet, another gravitational object. And so he ran the calculations that there has to be another planet out there, and he could plot its orbit, and he sent the information to another astronomer who looked into the sky with a telescope and found an undiscovered planet on the basis of math. Triumph of abstract reasoning. And he got into the Légion d'honneur, became very famous, Lescarbot, big guy. His name is engraved on the Eiffel Tower. Well, he said, well, that was fun, he said after that. Let me study some other planets' orbits and see what I found. And he studied the orbit of the planet Mercury, and guess what? Mercury's orbit wobbles. It really does. And so he said, okay, well, there has to be a cause, there has to be a reason why this is happening. There's obviously some other planet there. And people would say, well, we can understand an undiscovered planet way out beyond Uranus, but an undiscovered planet that's so close to Mercury, I mean, surely we would have seen it. And the counter was, no, it's a small planet, and it's so close to the sun that most of the time it can't even be seen. So astronomers began using his calculations to look for this planet, and they find it. And they name it Vulcan, by the way, the planet Vulcan, named for the blacksmith in Greco-Roman mythology, whose skin is dark and hair is burnt because he's the blacksmith of the gods and stays close to the fire. So here's this planet very close to the sun. Now, I think a lot of people in the world of political science, and the last thing I want to do, by the way, is diss the field of political science. I teach in a political studies department, so my life would be very unpleasant if I said this. A lot of it is actually very useful and helpful, and there's some things you can't think about without ideas and abstractions and generalizations, but they can get you into trouble. So anyway, they find the planet Vulcan, and again, huge celebrations. People become celebrities. People then spot it around the world. Thomas Edison saw it during a transit of the sun out in Wyoming. It's a big deal. But over time, it starts looking a little strange because actually it doesn't quite add up. The sightings are not identical. It's not really, the orbit doesn't seem, as far as we can track an orbit, it doesn't seem consistent or doesn't follow the predicted path. people start theorizing, well, maybe there are two planets, Vulcan, and it's their interaction that causes the wobble. Ultimately, what happens is that Einstein's theory of relativity basically finds an alternative way to describe, to account for the wobble in Mercury's orbit, which is that the space-time context is bent by the gravity of the sun. That really is causing what we see around Mercury. And it's a pretty, the explanation is held up. I may not have given a great example of it then. I need the book in front of me to get it completely right. Now, some of you may be saying, and what does all of this have to do with America's Israel policy? It's this. There are political scientists and others out there who say, look, America orbits the sun of its national interest on a smooth and predictable orbit. Countries follow their national interest. America is a country, therefore America follows its national interest. And certain types of realists will actually say internal politics are irrelevant to foreign policy because its foreign policy is driven by the structure of the international state system. So for them, the planets, the countries really are, billiard balls on a pool table or planets orbiting a sun whose motion doesn't matter what the various life forms on a planet are doing. But, they say, when it comes to Israel, America doesn't follow national interests. All right? America, and a big example many used was the Iraq War and said, aha, the war in Iraq was not in America's interest. It was, however, in Israel's interest. And look who backed it. Look at all those neocons in the Bush White House. And guess what? They're Jewish. And the idea is that there is an Israel lobby of some kind that is driving the formation of American foreign policy. Now, I'm caricaturing actually what's a much more complicated argument, but in the time we have, there's no way to do it. And I'm not trying to sort of diss people or make them look worse than they need to. But what I am saying is that this is a case where, in fact, what I try to do in the book is look at American policy toward Israel, think hard about what the American national interest is, and what I find is that actually American foreign policy, America makes its foreign policy toward Israel pretty much the way it does toward many other countries. And this theory that somehow there is an Israel lobby or a Jewish lobby or whatever you want to say that controls American foreign policy when it comes to Israel and things Jewish, does not stand the test of history at all. If the Jews ran the United States, okay, first of all, I would say which Jews? George Soros, right? Or AIPAC? I mean, which Jews are we talking about? So the idea that the Jews are some sort of monolithic interest group, that falls apart in 5 minutes. But if they did, we think about the 1930s, where the Jews are being persecuted by Hitler in Germany. American Jews are saying, well, we want the United States to put real diplomatic pressure on Germany to stop the persecution of German Jews. What did they get? Nothing. And they say, well, if you can't stop the persecution, can you at least increase immigration quotas so that more Jews can get out of this terrible situation? They get nothing. All right? Then actually during World War II, 1944, the Jewish leaders come to Washington with, asking just this simple thing. Can you spare a few airplanes to bomb the railroad tracks leading to Auschwitz so we can at least slow down the operation of the Nazi death machine? They get nothing. However, somehow, Vulcan theorists will tell us, between 1944 and 1948, the Jews conquer the United States because they say it's Jewish pressure that led Harry Truman to endorse the independence of Israel. Right? So Truman is seen to be putty in the hands of Jewish overlords but there's no history. Then immediately, 1953, Eisenhower takes power, and as I say in the book, all those powerful Jews must have died of the plague because Eisenhower sides with Nasser. In 1956, he forces the Israelis out of Sinai during the Suez Crisis. Okay, nothing. No power. The American Jewish lobby, if it exists and if it runs the country, is completely powerless in the face of Eisenhower. So, this theory does not work. It doesn't hold up to facts. When Israel was weak and really needed a protector, that would be in the 1950s and early 1960s, the United States was nowhere to be seen. All right? Israel did not, I say this in the book, Israel did not become strong because it had an American alliance. It gained an American alliance because it had become strong. It's after 1967 when Israel is a regional superpower, after 1969 when it appears to have had nuclear weapons, that the United States really first becomes seriously interested in working closely with Israel. This is normal behavior for nations. This is not some weird wobble in the American orbit. As for the Iraq War, I think even many of the people who once attributed George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq to the Israel lobby have given up on that because the facts just don't work. Just for one thing, the neoconservative idea that all Iraq needed and all the Arab world needed was democracy in order to make them pro-Israel and pro-American is an idea that would not enter the head of the serious Israeli politician of any party. All right? This in Israel sounds like total insanity. All right? And to somehow say George W. Bush is a president, a large majority of American Jews voted against him in 2000 and 2004. Not only that, but the majority of campaign donations from Jewish donors in both of those elections went to his Democratic opponents. And yet you had people all over the world saying that George W. Bush's administration represented the power of American Jews. Same thing with Donald Trump. All right? There's been no politician in our lifetimes as cordially hated by such a large percentage of the American Jewish community as Donald Trump, right? And again, if your goal was to raise money from Jewish donors for your political campaign, the smart move is not to endorse Donald Trump, all right? You're going to be the strongest anti-Trumpist out there. And yet, around the world and among certain people in the United States, Trump's Israel policies are taken as proof that the Jews run the United States. Or, this is anti-Semitism. This is nothing other than anti-Semitism at work. I'm not saying, by the way, that these people are conscious haters of the Jews, but they have embraced a set of ideas out of prejudice, out of ignorance, that basically reenact the worst stereotypes about the Jews. That they are clever, that they are united, they are secret, they think only of themselves, they act as a single community, as a single force. If you know many American Jews, you will know this is not actually how they operate. If you spend any time in Israel, you will know this is not really not a very good description of how the state of Israel works. But these stereotypes exist in the West. They primarily come out of medieval Christianity, where Jews were seen as a threat to the sort of Catholic unity of medieval Europe. Unfortunately, Martin Luther embraced this at part of his life, but in general, the Reformation acted in certain ways to reduce prejudice against the Jews and open a path toward Jewish enlightenment and Jewish integration. So, what does that say about political science and IR theory? I don't want to, you probably see what I mean. Look, the world of foreign policy, the world of international affairs is so complicated that I can tell you this: no living human being fully understands all the dynamics at work. All right? one of my interesting things is the Council on Foreign Relations. I was the Henry Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy for a while, which meant I got to know Henry Kissinger and spent a fair amount of time talking with him over the years. I can tell you this, at 99 years of age, Henry Kissinger is still learning new things about the world. He just wrote a book on like quantum computing, all right? He is still adopting and changing his ideas in the face of new facts, all right? If Henry Kissinger is still learning, nobody in this room can say we've got it. And yet, foreign affairs, international affairs is so important to our personal security, the lives of our families, the future of the human race, that we desperately want, we need to tell ourselves that we understand it. And so people take theories and abstractions are ways we try to simplify immensely complex data sets in order to make some sense of them, and you need them. Otherwise, you really couldn't think, all you would do was utter proper nouns. You wouldn't be able to relate them or whatever. But the desperation that makes us sort of cling, or the thing that drives people toward conspiracy theories. I want a simple explanation that will tell me what's happening. That drive for a simple, all-embracing explanation often leads the unwary into the trap of anti-Semitism, because that's what anti-Semitism at its heart is. It's a conspiracy theory, a grand simplification that reduces the complexity of international life to a simple black hat, white hat story, and allows people an illusion of understanding and control. But at the same time, what anti-Semitism does to the anti-Semite is a horrible curse. In fact, if anything, it reinforces my confidence in the Bible. That God blesses those who bless Israel and curses those who curse Israel. The curse of anti-Semitism is a terrible mental curse. If you think the Jews run the banks, it means you have no clue how the financial system operates. Okay? If you think the Jews run American politics, it means you are a babe in the woods when it comes to understanding the complexities of power in American society. If you think the Jews run the media, and that the Jews, through their domination of the media, impose pro-Israel sentiments on people, you're going to have a hard time with Fox News, which is the only major media outlet that is pro-Likud and is owned by the Australian Christian Rupert Murdoch, and has people like Sean Hannity and Carl Tucker, those well-known Jewish names, as its leading spokespeople. All right? The New York Times was actually a pro-Zionist newspaper before it was bought by a Jewish family, and then became an anti-Zionist newspaper for many years once a Jewish family owned it. All right? The anti-Semite is incapable of understanding the basic facts of political, economic, and social life, and so gets led into one disastrous miscalculation and misapprehension after another.
Thank you, Walter. You wrote somewhat tongue-in-cheek that an alternate title for this book that you considered was "Don't Blame Israel on the Jews," and I think you covered much of it there. But you also write at length about the strong support in America that exists quite independent of America's Jewish communities throughout history.
That's right.
Could you discuss?
Yeah, well, it's American Jews were not particularly pro-Zionist through most of modern history. The situation, J Street, to some degree, represents the Jewish American community's historical beliefs better than something like AIPAC, to some degree. On the other hand, American Christians have been pro-Israel for a really long time, before there was an Israeli state. Before Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat, which President Benjamin Harrison was peacefully sitting in his office smoking a cigar and probably trying to fan the smoke away so his wife would think he had quit. when the Secretary of State came in with a preacher, a friend of D.L. Moody's, whose name some of you may know, and brought him a petition asking President Harrison to use his influence to get the European powers to use their influence to get the Ottoman Sultan to declare a Jewish national home in Palestine. This petition was signed by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who was William McKinley, who would go on to become a very popular president soon afterwards, and a whole galaxy of religious and intellectual leaders in the American community, by almost all Protestant, by the way, and with Jews really not represented. And so before the organized modern Zionist movement under Herzl was even an idea in Herzl's head, the American establishment, Gentile establishment, was solidly in favor, on the record, as favoring the establishment of a Jewish state. Where does this come from? There are really two sources. One of them is religious and one of them is civil, but they tend to kind of mix back and forth a little bit. Religiously, there's a long tradition in the sort of primarily Calvinist schools of Protestantism, out of which most American Christianity came, to interpret, and not just the Calvinists, but some others, to interpret the prophecies of the Old Testament as predicting a Jewish return to the land of Israel in the final days, toward the climax of history, however we think of that. And you find people like Increase Mather, the 17th century Boston clergyman, writing about it in a book. Actually, John Milton referred to it in Paradise Lost. Isaac Newton did. Jonathan Edwards believed that this is what the Bible taught. And there's this tradition of understanding the prophets. And so when the Jewish Zionist movement actually begins, a lot of American Christians immediately say, whoa. This is very important because the Jewish Zionist movement is growing in the 1910s and 20s. This is the time of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, when doubts about the authority of the Bible are becoming massive in American Protestantism. And so the German biblical scholarship and the idea, critical theories of the Old Testament, Isaiah's not one book written by one guy. There's Deutero, maybe Tritero. Who knows how many Isaiahs there are, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, what the Rise of Israel does is it sort of says, okay, fine, there might be one Isaiah, 5 Isaiahs, 8 Isaiahs. And some of them might have written 200 years after the first Isaiah, but none of them were written before 1910. And they're all predicting this. So the Jewish move back to Palestine for religious Americans, for Christians, concerned about the authority of the Bible and the truth of their religion, both the continued existence of the Jews as a testimony to God's power and the durability of God's promises, but also then their miraculous return to the Holy Land. And the more you look at the story, the more unlikely it is, the odder that story looks. So it seems like a major biblical miracle unfolding in your own time. Add to that, think about what happens, think about the 1940s. 1944, Soviet troops enter Auschwitz and the other extermination camps, and the photographs of the survivors begin to appear and the atrocity becomes real. There'd been talk and rumors and news stories, but here is incontrovertible physical evidence of the most unimaginable horror you can expect. And what this does is it puts a bullet hole in the heart of Enlightenment optimism. The idea that science and technology are going to cure the moral diseases of humanity and create a new human being who won't do all those nasty things that we used to do out of ignorance and competition for scarce resources. This is happening not in some obscure, quote, uncivilized part of the world. It's happening in Germany, where the philosophy, the technology of the Western world had reached an extraordinary peak. And so now we are seeing that the dream of a fundamental transformation in human nature through the Enlightenment doesn't make sense. 1945, Hiroshima. And so suddenly this species which suffers moral ills that we have no idea how to cure has now acquired the power to exterminate itself through nuclear weapons. And in 1950 the Soviets get theirs. By the way, Billy Graham's breakthrough crusade in Los Angeles occurs about a week after the announcement of the first Soviet nuclear test. So, and throughout Billy Graham's career, the potential possibility of nuclear holocaust is one of the constant signs that he invokes in helping people understand the difficulties and dangers of our time. So, but then what happens in 1948? Against the odds, the state of Israel emerges. God is at work in the world. All right? However terrifying the world looks, however depraved humanity is, the God of the Bible is at work in the world. And I think over the decades, as we continue to live in this post-Hiroshima, post-Auschwitz space, the idea that the existence and the flourishing of Israel testifies to the power of the living God in human history has been an immense consolation to Christians all over the United States, many of whom never, don't join any pro-Israel organizations, but they feel good. They feel glad that Israel exists. And that's the religious dimension, okay? But there's a secular dimension to this as well. You think about American culture in the 18th, early 19th century. The Americans at that time saw themselves as riding a crest of progress in human history. You had the classical era, and that was fantastic. You had the Greeks, you had the Romans, you had the Hebrews, these magnificent peoples of antiquity who had liberty, culture, pure religion, all of this great stuff. And then Christianity, the cherry on the sundae. But then the Dark Ages come. The barbarians' invasions destroy civilization. The peoples are destroyed, oppressed by tyrants. Religion is polluted and perverted. Right? But then things begin to happen. The Renaissance, we rediscover the classical heritage. The Reformation, we rediscover the purer forms of Christian faith and begin to purge what Protestants would say is the medieval superstition. Then the Glorious Revolution in England, the principles of liberty that come to us from the classic world are now being revealed and are once again dominant. When they are threatened, the American Revolution saves them and saves the New World for liberty. All right? So this rising tide of history. Now, the people at that time looked at the three great peoples of antiquity, the Romans, the Greeks, the Jews. And what did they see? In every case, in antiquity, you read Roman poetry, Greek poetry, Hebrew scriptures. Palestine was flourishing and beautiful. Greece was flourishing and beautiful. Italy was flourishing, rich and beautiful. They didn't look that way in the 19th century. Rome was a malarial swamp. The Italians were under the rule of the Pope, which American Protestants thought was pretty disgusting. And in fact, historically, clerics have not been good secular rulers. And various Habsburg princes and other dynasts oppressing the Italians. The Greeks were under the Ottoman Empire, persecuted, weak. Greece had been eroded by overgrazing and neglect. It was practically a desert. And the Jews were scattered through the world, despised and hated everywhere. And Palestine, Mark Twain, when he visited, said, well, the only thing I've ever seen that's worse is Arizona. So, all right. So that's, and here's what the Americans at the time thought, that American principles could revive those peoples of liberty, of democracy, of honest, hard work on the farm, that if those peoples could find American values, they would be, instead of being despised, poor, and oppressed, they could become rich and strong, and this would show the whole world that America was right. So when the Greeks rise up against the Ottoman Empire, actually Americans go fight in the Greek War of Independence, right? Garibaldi in the Italian Wars of Unification is a huge American hero. They try to recruit him as a general in the Civil War. And the Americans, mostly wrongly, predict great things for free Greece and free Italy. But the Jewish case is still there. And Americans are convinced that if the Jews would just go back to Israel, farm, and build a democracy, they would go from being a weak, despised people that the whole world hated and looked down on, and become strong, free, and prosperous. And that amazing result of the application of American principles to the tragic condition of the Jewish people would be a living demonstration, impossible to ignore, to the whole world, that America was right. And so when the Jews begin to embrace Zionism, both secular and religious Americans are not saying, oh no, those awful Jews, now they're going to try to jam their Zionist project down the throats of the world. They're saying, oh great, finally the Jews are figuring it out. We've been trying to tell them this. In fact, Americans tried to build an agricultural colony of Jews near Jerusalem in the 19th century. It didn't work out very well, but you can actually go to Jerusalem now and stay in the very nice American Colony Hotel, which is what's left of this colonization effort. I recommend the hotel highly. But great rugs everywhere. So the thing is that Americans saw, whether they were religious or secular, saw the rise of Israel as confirming American ideas and ideals. Right? And I think that has created a strong pro-Israel sentiment that doesn't translate into, like, on every policy question, let's do what Israel wants. It doesn't work that way. But there's just a general sense of well-wishing and a sense of some kind of deep bond between the two countries. So none of this, I can say, has anything to do with anything American Jews or Jews anywhere did to Americans. These are the consequences of cultural trends and beliefs that are deeply encoded in American history and American culture. These are not Jewish products or Jewish impositions. This is what America thinks and how it feels.
Thank you, Walter. With that, I think we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. George, have you got the mic? Okay. Ma'am?
There's a mic? How are we going to do this?
George is coming with a mic, I think, right there. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for, is this on? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Can you tell us who you are?
My name's Deborah Weiss, and I am Jewish, actually. Supported Bush and Trump and Israel. And my question is, would you say that Reagan was a Wilsonian in his foreign policy? Because my understanding is that his mother taught him at a very young age that God had a special role for America, and it seems like he was trying to advance freedom and Israel.
Right. I think our strongest presidents often don't belong to only one school. You know, I think for a political leader who knows what they're doing, the four schools are almost like the four strings of a violin. And you're able to produce, using all four strings, you're able to produce the music that you need to lead the people. And I think Reagan was really quite adept at in some ways being very practical minded, in some ways being very idealistic, very soaring rhetoric, but really quite practical steps, and sometimes getting out of things. After the bombing of the Marines in Beirut, he just gets out. So I would say Reagan is one of those presidents that's hard to pin down.
Thank you, Deborah. Mike's coming, sir. Yep.
So you, Deborah, are a minority in a minority.
I am. Actually, the Orthodox Jews, though.
Are more, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's fairly recent.
My name is Jonathan Pavlik. Walter, I noticed the title of the book, Covenant, A Covenant, the Ark of a Covenant, calls to mind the whole Abrahamic history. And you did quote those verses in passing about, I will bless those who bless thee and curse those who curse thee, which is God's words to Abraham at one point. And I'm wondering to what degree, what weight would you assign to American sentiments who believed in that proposition? Okay, I'm not expecting you to interpret whether that's a valid interpretation, that is a promise made to Abraham and all his descendants, whether that's the promise made to the descendants through Isaac rather than through the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac and all the rest. I will bless those who bless thee has been kind of the motto of those who want to cheerlead for blessing Israel in a certain way. What weight do you think in terms of accounting for American foreign policy development is the true believers along the lines of that covenantal promise?
Well, it's not nothing, but it's less than you might think. I mean, the latest Pew polls I see say that something like about 14% of the U.S. consists of white evangelicals. Maybe 16%. The numbers vary, and the share has gone down in recent years. But you look at that number, and then you add to that American Jews at about 2%. You get 16 to 18% of the population. The percent of the population that tells pollsters that they sympathize with Israel or are pro-Israel is pretty consistently over 50%. So, white evangelicals, even if we assume that they are all united on this, which is certainly not the case, do not account for more than about a third of the reported pro-Israel sentiment in the United States. So it's real, it plays a role. It is perhaps was more important a generation ago, but it is not the dominant force. It's this mix of things, I think, that makes it go the way it goes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ethan Gutman. I saw in the book how you drew a parallel between the United States and Israel's providential character, and also their historical, alignment in different ways. And I was thinking if maybe you could account for some of the differences in our histories and also the way that we understand ourselves. For example, the United States and Israel both fought a war of independence, but those wars of independence were very different and had different outcomes. And I was wondering if you saw any difficulties between the United States and Israeli relations because of that historical difference.
Good. Well, fortunately, we both won our wars of independence, and the British were the bad guys in both wars. So there's some elements of continuity. Look, I would say that the biggest difference between America and Israel is, and again, we're overgeneralizing, and there are lots of people in both countries. But Herzl's message, Theodor Herzl, the founder of what became the Zionist movement, basically his message to the Jews of Europe was, if you believe in liberalism and the Enlightenment and you trust the Jewish future to the Enlightenment and to the strength of liberal principles, we are all going to die. All right? These very, very nice French Dreyfusards and enlightened Europeans who want to integrate you into Europe, they're very nice, and I like them and I admire them. But we are going to get killed. They will not be able to hold back this tide of anti-Semitism that is rising. Okay? And so liberalism will kill the Jews. faith in liberalism will kill the Jews. Israeli Jews, by and large, are people who in their bones think Herzl was right. And that, the United Nations and good resolutions and international law and liberal order, if we Israelis entrust our survival to these, we not only will die, we deserve to die for stupidity, right? That's the dominant Israeli mindset. There are others, there are different views, but that's basically it. American Jews are basically, liberalism has really paid off for us, and thanks to liberal principles of toleration, American Jews enjoy a kind of a citizenship and security that Jews haven't had anywhere, and frankly, we're safer than those Jews in Israel because we don't have Iran aiming nuclear weapons at us. We're trying to. Okay? So that division between Israeli Jews and American Jews runs very deep. I think it accounts for a lot of what we've seen in Jewish politics in the last 10 or 20 years. But it also, that's the difference between Americans generally and Israelis generally. Americans also, by and large, not universally, but we think the liberal principles of American constitutional order are enough to, we can trust them for our future. Israelis don't. That make sense?
Professor Mead, thank you so much for coming. Your writings have been a huge blessing and just wonderful to read you every week in the Wall Street Journal. Can you talk about why you wrote the book? It must have took an enormous amount of time, and you have a lot of different interests and responsibilities. And do you think the United States' relationship with Israel is critical? And how would you counsel this current administration, or really any administration, in terms of a relationship with Israel?
Well, I honestly, I talked about this in the first chapter. I didn't think this was going to be such a big book when I started. I thought I was basically going to sort of write a quick book about why the Israel lobby theory is misguided, and quickly, quick little overview of the history of the relationship. A very unambitious book. But as I got into it, it kept getting more complicated and harder, but also both more interesting and more important. Because what I started to find was that using this relationship as a lens to understand how Americans think about the world generally and how American foreign policy has developed over the last 100 years, I think you can actually get a unique and valuable perspective on that. So this became an opportunity to sort of not only share some ideas about the U.S.-Israel relationship, but to present a sort of a larger picture, a richer picture of how America engages with foreign policy in ways that I hope a lot of readers will find useful. And I also, something that helped me, I think, was that I made a decision early on, I'm not going to write an advocacy book. The book does not take a position. This is not the Walter Mead secret Middle East peace plan. Like a lot of people in American foreign policy, I've written those, but I'm not writing, that's not, this book, ideally somebody who, doesn't like Israel very much would find this book helpful and engaging and interesting, and somebody who's really very fond of Israel would also find it that I find that so much of the commentary about this is sort of two sides screaming at each other. And also, if you think about the whole process of canceling people in the American university, there's so much effort, on one side to cancel professors and others who were seen as too pro-Palestinian, but also, and increasingly now, to cancel people who are seen as too pro-Israel or anti-BDS or whatever it may be. And so, trying to provide a book that everybody can pay attention to and learn from on such a hot button subject struck me as a a really powerful and important goal in itself. Now, whether or not I've done that, time will tell, but I'm giving it my best shot.
I think we have time for 2 more, Shannon. Is that about right? Okay.
Hi, my name is William Roberts. Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about what happened with Israel's victory within Israel that caused them to kind of shift to and look to the U.S. You mentioned how there was very strong support for Israel in Europe beforehand, and the French had a very active role even going forward. I was hoping you could speak to what happened with those victories within Israel specifically that caused them to kind of shift who they looked to.
Okay. Well, Israel had always wanted an American alliance. Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister and really the founder of the modern Israeli state, always wanted an American alliance. And one of the key moments for him actually came at the start of the Korean War when he sided with the West at the UN as a way of putting some markers down, and that pretty much ended what was left of the Stalin flirtation with Israel. The French alliance was on its last legs. De Gaulle had told the Israelis that the French were ending their relationship. Basically, after the French pulled out of Algeria in 1962, they really had no reason to continue to want to work with Israel. So Israel was somewhat homeless. So that's part of it. What really happens, the man who made the alignment, I won't call it an alliance at this point in history, was Richard Nixon. Again, probably next to Donald Trump and George W. Bush, the least popular president among American Jews in modern history. And in 1973, with the Yom Kippur War, that's really when it comes home to Washington once and for all that the Soviet Union is using Arab hostility to Israel as a way to build its own position in the Middle East, and that the United States needs to make sure that the Soviet allies are losing and seen to lose. And also, see, the U.S. had always wanted this alliance with Egypt in the 50s and 60s, but Nasser's goal for Egypt was he was a pan-Arabist. He wanted Egypt to become, he saw himself as the Bismarck or the Garibaldi of the Arabians, and he would unite all the Arab countries under Egypt's banner, which, by the way, would mean all of the oil-producing countries would come under Egyptian power, which Americans thought was a terrible idea because he would then have an ability to blackmail the world, including us. So we were never going to support his pan-Arab aspirations, and as long as that was the key to Nasser's foreign policy, the U.S. and Egypt could not have a relationship. But with the defeat of the Six-Day War, that period in Egyptian history had come to an end, and Sadat, when he takes power following Nasser's death, Sadat understands this, and actually now Sadat is interested in the development of Egypt. The heck with Arab unity and so on. I got millions of people here in Egypt that are depending on me. I need the Suez Canal to be reopened for tolls. I need my territory back, etc. And so I'm willing to, and the way to do that is not to align with the Soviet Union, which has worse weapons and less money, but actually to see if I can't go back and get the offer that Eisenhower was willing to make. So in that sense, Egypt's abandonment of its pan-Arab ambitions allows the U.S. to have a strong relationship and just to simultaneously deepen its relationships with Israel and Egypt as both are as a way of winning the Cold War in the Middle East. And Israel was quite happy to do this, even though part of the price was that the U.S. was limiting some of Israel's, many of the Israeli generals wanted to crush all of Sadat's army that was on the east bank of the Suez Canal following, their initial offensive. And Kissinger and Nixon were of the view that it was actually you want Sadat to have the political power in Egypt to do what they knew he wanted to do next. So the Israelis, this thing of the Israelis accepting some constraints on their behavior because of the American ability to broker larger outcomes that mattered more to them, Nixon sets the pattern for that. So it's not so much that Israel decided to court the United States, it's that the American perception of its interests in the Middle East changed.
One last question.
Oh, thank you. My name's Earl Foote, and you touched on this briefly, but the question of liberal Christians and an anti-Israel feeling, I mean, as an Episcopalian, I'm ashamed of some of the resolutions that have been passed in this diocese and some nationally. So do you have any thoughts? I know that the viewpoint is that the Palestinians are the victims and the Israelis are the oppressors, and I don't agree with that. But any thoughts as to how to approach people who strictly view it as as you said, overdog, underdog situation?
Well, I think one thing to do is to try to separate the moral dimensions, and this can be very difficult in a Christian setting or indeed any religious setting. Foreign policy can't completely ignore moral values, but it can't also be driven entirely by them. It just can't. So we can't let the situation of the Tibetans or of the Uyghurs drive our entire policy toward China. I mean, the great example is during World War II, we needed Stalin as an ally, even though over his career he probably killed more people than Hitler did. So in foreign policy, you know, you hope to be moral, but that doesn't mean that you can be moralistic at every point. So the question of American policy in the Middle East should not be who stands higher on the global victimization index, the Palestinians or the Jews or the other people. Just like we're aware that there's a Kurdish issue in Turkey, but that can't be the be-all and the end-all of our Turkey policy. So I think part of what we need to do in order to have a more rational discussion of U.S.-Israeli relations is to encourage people to start thinking of Israel as just another country. You know, when Turkey does something bad, and under President Erdogan it sometimes does, we don't say Turkey has lost its right to exist, right? We don't say that the actions of the generals in Myanmar mean that that country no longer has a right to exist. So, you know, this notion that somehow Israel is on probation and must continually earn the right to exist by behaving in an exemplary way, it's not true. America has a lot of allies who have a lot of warts around the world. I mean, this I'm sure will come as a shock to everyone here, but America itself has a fair number of actual warts. And so we need to try to bring that into the picture a bit. I think for liberal Protestants, too, that there's a little bit of American identity wars are getting fought out, projected into the Israeli-Palestinian space. So, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, African Americans were some of the most zealous supporters of Israel. Martin Luther King was one of the most active Zionists in the United States. And even Paul Robeson, who was a member of the Communist Party, performed at a fundraiser for the Irgun, which was the military arm of the Likud party, the most radical group in Israel. And there was a sense at that time among a lot of people in the black community, which certainly not entirely gone away to this day, that as a people in slavery coming out of bondage, you know, black Americans could identify with the Jewish experience. To some degree, with Malcolm X and his conversion to Orthodox Islam and the radicalization of some blacks, They began to see them, more as like Palestinians, identified with the Palestinians, the people under occupation with limited rights. And then you start getting a left-right polarization around Israel-Palestine, to some degree driven by your views of American domestic politics. And I think, many people in the U.S. who support Israel do so out of identity politics. I've talked about some of those factors earlier. And many people who oppose Israel do so out of identity politics. It would be nice if we could have foreign policy conversations about Israel.
Thank you, Walter. And thank you very much for this evening, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Walter.